So this is one that I'm really excited about. It's another extra history video about vampires. This is one that I'm very excited about because I've sort of heard a little bit about, and it's local. I'm from Rhode Island, which, this story takes place in Rhode Island. This is a story that I think Bird Mom knew and I didn't. She's like, "Oh, you got to hear about it." I think she tried to tell me the story once, but I was doing a bad job listening. I'm sorry. So it's called New England Vampire Panic. Extra history. That should be really interesting. So it's going to be happening pretty close to where I grew up. I guess Rhode Island, it's the smallest state in the United States, so anywhere in it is close to where I grew up in the grand scheme of things.
Exeter, Rhode Island, March 16th, 1892. George Brown is under siege. Nearly a decade ago, his wife and eldest daughter had passed from consumption. Then last year, both remaining children, his son Edwin and daughter Mercy, also fell ill. When it began, it seemed Edwin would go first, but the 19-year-old Mercy rapidly deteriorated and died in January. So much death, said his neighbors, a suspicious amount. They began to badger him, insisting that an evil lived under his family plot, a ghastly corpse spirit that was draining his family, and soon would take others. He knows, they say, what he must do. But George...
So this is a Brown family. The last name is Brown. I don't know if they're related. Like, Rhode Island, we have Brown University, which comes from a very famous Brown family, but I don't believe this is the same family. I feel like I would know this if it was part of the John Brown family.
A man never given to superstition resists as long as possible. But in a small town, the neighbors must be satisfied. So he gives his grudging permission. His beloved wife and daughters will be turned out of their graves and cut open to see which of them is secretly an undead killer.
Man, this is like the end of the freaking
This episode
19th century
checkups program of Minnesota. We know
right?
there can be a lot of barriers to keep you and your family from getting.
This is the end. Yeah, this is at like the turn of the 20th century. Man, and they're still like thinking it's vampires. There are still people who believe in like ghosts walking the street or whatever. And like I was nearby Brown University the other day, and I heard a story that Edgar Allan Poe was seen wandering on Benefit Street in Providence, which it's a funny story because he was courting a woman on that street, and there are people who still believe he's walking the street. So I guess vampires are no more absurd than that, I suppose.
Into a clinic, but they're here to help. Plus, children from birth to age 21 may even qualify for free checkups. Learn more at u21checkups.com. George Brown was...
So the promo code is still active since this is a very new video, so I'm going to watch through ads or whatever out of like courtesy. So the promo code's on screen. Do with that what you will.
Not the only man who had to make this decision. In 1990, a group of boys playing in a Connecticut gravel pit unearthed an old cemetery. Not too uncommon in New England, and the archaeological...
I'm almost alive at this time.
Unusual. Until, that is, they came across a red coffin with JB55 studded into the lid. Later analysis identified this as the likely grave of John Barber, a farmer who died in the mid-19th century. But it wasn't Barber's life that interested them. It was that a decade after Barber's death, someone had exhumed his coffin, broken it up, and mangled his body. He'd been decapitated, his ribs cut open, his skull placed face down on his chest, with his femurs crossed below it in the shape of an X. The discovery made international news because John Barber's grave is the only archaeological evidence of a phenomenon that gripped America's East Coast during the 18th and 19th century, the Great New England Vampire Panic. During this period, New England suffered an epidemic of townsfolk exhuming and mutilating the dead.
Sorry, Salt and Pepper. I wished you good night earlier, and I didn't read your message clearly enough. You should get some rest. You should get some rest. If it's 8 in the morning where you are and you haven't gotten enough sleep, get some rest. Don't stick here on my account. The VOD will be there. Get your rest. Go about your day. There will be time for it. Take care of yourself.
Corpses were feeding on the living. Historians and folklorists have documented over 80 examples in letters, diaries, and newspapers, with more being discovered all the time, including some in the Midwest and South. However, this epidemic of imaginary undead was driven by a very real medical epidemic, that of tuberculosis. Beginning in the late 18th century, tuberculosis, or
TB was really bad. Like, it was a death sentence in certain times.
TB, then known as consumption, ravaged the eastern United States. And at certain points in the 19th century, up to a quarter of New England's deaths were related to the disease. Now, back in 2019, thanks to Child and Teen Checkups, we did a whole 2-part series on the development of the tuberculosis vaccine.
Oh shoot, what
Which
up?
you should definitely check out after this episode if you already haven't. But for now, here's what you need to know.
We should probably check that out at some
Vicious
point.
Bacterial infection, one that makes its victims cough blood and seems to consume them, hence the older name consumption. It also had a course that was difficult to understand in the days before modern medicine. One family member might catch it and have a protracted illness, dying gradually over months or years, though another might seem to be terminal, then suddenly go into remission for a decade, only to take a quick turn for the worse later in life. Or you could die within weeks of presenting symptoms, never knowing that you'd been asymptomatic for years. This dramatic, deadly, and unpredictable nature made
Terrifying.
consumption fertile soil for superstition and folklore, as people sought some way to feel in control of a malady they couldn't cure, predict, or understand. So at times, they turned toward old beliefs for an answer. But keep in mind, those beliefs probably aren't what you're imagining right now. First off, you should understand that all of the documents we have on the so-called vampire panic come from outsiders, people observing these ritual acts or reporting on them for newspapers. And crucially, it's those people who used the term vampire. There's no evidence that participants ever used that word. However, there were long traditions dating back to Europe that corpses had magic properties, and that there was a mystical connection between dead and living family members. In some places, if rigor mortis didn't set in quickly when a family member passed, it was seen as an omen that another relative would soon die. The bodies of murder victims were said to bleed in their killer's presence, and in the case of the vampire panic, a host of folkloric beliefs centered around evil spirits possessing the bodies of the dead and using them to drain relatives of life. So don't imagine a classical vampire here. No one thought these bodies were rising from the ground.
As we've learned throughout this stream, as we've learned more about different vampire lores, we've sort of come to recognize that vampires don't take a single form, and that they've come in many, many different cultures and have all sorts of different rules and whatever. And this is the one of the versions, just sort of an undead person.
Grave. Instead, in this lore, it seems an evil spirit would enter the corpse and dwell inside it, then come out at night in order to feed, or else simply use some other mystical connection between the body and a family member to siphon.
This one has some mixes of some of the different types we've learned about, or at least I think it does. It's got some elements. It's not just an undead person. I misspoke there. It's far more complicated than that.
Off blood. In some European stories, this spirit masquerades as an animal, but in others, it appears to have been invisible. This was their explanation for why consumption ripped through families while also behaving so oddly. To rid a community of such a harmful spirit took fortitude. First, they would need to find it, unearthing bodies of consumption victims until they found one that showed symptoms of spirit possession. An afflicted corpse would look plump and well-fed, perhaps even have blood trickling from its mouth. The hair and fingernails might have grown, and most crucial of all, there would be liquid blood in the heart. Now today, we know that these are all natural signs of decay. Gas can make a body bloat, skin retreating makes it appear that fingernails and hair have grown, and especially in tuberculosis victims, blood on the lips is not unusual. Once villagers found the host body, they would go about sabotaging it. They might simply turn the corpse over, so the confused spirit would go down into the ground rather than up towards the living. But they also might decapitate it.
They really do think it's like a total doofus, and it just doesn't know what ways. I don't know. So, sometimes, like, a lot of the superstition around these things make the threat feel like less of a threat. If that's all it takes to, like, confuse it, it feels a lot less scary.
Or bind its feet. And in parts of Eastern Europe, they'd use a wooden or iron stake to pin it to the ground. Then the villagers or family members would remove and burn the heart and liver, with the spirit's current victims then inhaling those vapors in order to heal their consumption. Now, this didn't work, of course, but given the random nature of TB, a remission might be interpreted as success. Most of the records we have of this include local clergy and doctors condemning this practice, or journalists using it to shock urban readers. And that last one was precisely what happened with the Brown family from the show's opening. See, while George Brown had refused to be present at the exhumation of his family members, a newspaper reporter was there to witness the event, and they would make it internationally famous. While the
fun.
found nothing but bones in the coffins of George's wife and eldest daughter, they did find Mercy's body surprisingly well preserved, with liquid blood still in the heart.
Oh no.
Since she'd only been dead 2 months and had been stored in a cold above-ground vault. Nonetheless, they extracted her heart and liver and burned the organs on a stone. Then, forming a tonic with the ashes, they had her brother Edwin drink the concoction.
No!
Now, first of all, imagine the trauma of that. Seeing neighbors
That's
mutilate
so
your
stupid.
sister, then being talked into consuming some of her ashes. It's hard to even contemplate the existential fear and desperation a community has to be under to even consider that. But perhaps what's more shocking is that this occurred in 1892. By then, not only was germ theory confirmed, but it was a full decade after Robert Koch had discovered the bacteria that causes
Nah, man, germs are a myth. I don't know what you're talking about.
tuberculosis. In fact, one of George Brown's conditions was that a doctor actually performed the autopsies. A doctor who pointed out that Mercy's lungs were full of tuberculosis bacteria. So, if all of that is true, why did they still go about desecrating Mercy's body? Well, here's the thing. The accepted scientific explanation, it didn't really help these people. While medical knowledge about TB had increased, they weren't seeing the practical effects of that yet, especially in rural New England. These explanations, awful as they were, did offer a sort of narrative closure for people.
A lot of people can't relate to science. Like, I don't consider myself scientifically minded and don't choose to explain a lot of things through science because it's not the way I understand things. However, I don't necessarily fall into superstition like this, but I can sort of understand how just because that's there, it doesn't make your life better. It's sort of like, it comes with like the comfort theory around religion. Like, if people just believe religion to feel comfortable, you just believe in ghosts because it gives you a certain meaning to the events that come around to it. It rationalizes it in a way that you can understand. And that's one of the arguments that's made about like organized religion or whatever. It's people do it just to make themselves feel comfortable. Like, people have a number of reasons why they do it. But of course, some people do it to make them feel comfortable.
Feeling of control when, even at a time, doctors could name and see the TB bacterium, no one could stop it. Which reminds us of two things. First, that medical education and outreach is important, but also that it needs to be practical. In the cities, there were anti-TB public information campaigns urging people to avoid spitting in public or limit overcrowding. Things that explained how TB works.
Oh yeah, anti-spitting campaigns would be huge.
While researchers pursued a working
In like the early 20th century, anti-spitting campaigns were huge, and they picked up even more with like the Great Influenza.
vaccine. By contrast, in the rural and economically depressed hamlet of Exeter, these messages weren't as present, so they relied on the old beliefs for comfort. At least until 1921, when the first working tuberculosis vaccine entered public use. Few present at Mercy's exhumation would live to see that day, except one, George Brown, who alone in his family never caught consumption and passed away in 1922, living just long enough to see the disease that had taken so
Dude, he must have.
much from him, defeated at last. Once again, thanks so much.
Oh, let's let this run.
Checkups program.
I'll give my last
Sponsoring
thoughts.
This episode. Remember, it's important for children to get annual checkups.
I remember that this
Because they're a great and
link
proactive
thing.
way of identifying symptoms, addressing concerns,
Oh wait, U21 checkups. This isn't even like a promo code thing. I just realized.
and setting a baseline for their happy, healthy future. Not to mention, child
Check out that
also
thing.
provides free mental health screenings for those under 21. You can learn more and
If
see
you-
your
if
child
you need it.
qualifies for free checkups over at
A lot of you are young, right?
That's the letter U, 21checkups.com.
Yeah, a lot of you, y'all are young. You might need
Alicia
something.
Bramble, Angelo Valenciana, Arcolite Games, Casey Mustia, Dominic Valenciana, Joseph Lame, and Kyle Murgatroyd.
I should become a legendary patron. I want one of these pictures. I would love that. Make my Twitter profile so quick. Great. Man, like I'm surprised. This is a very local story. This is Exeter. This is like sort of in the middle of Rhode Island. It's that's interesting. Some parts of Exeter are like really like woodsy and out there, and like I don't spend a lot of time out there, but you know, I feel like I would have heard this story in greater detail at this point in my life. And I've been like really zeroing in on Rhode Island history. Like, I've basically given up everything else. I'm mostly outside of like casual learning and any of my serious learning. It's mostly something I try to tie into local history. So this is, I mean, I think it's more even interesting to see like the cultural and social response to tuberculosis than just then the the novelty of it being like a vampire story. I think there's something even more interesting at the core of this. That was rad. That was pretty rad indeed. Most raddingly.